Good evening, everyone. I'm Donna DeSalvo. I'm Deputy Director for International Initiatives and Senior Curator here at the Whitney, and I'm the curator of Andy Warhol, From A to B and Back Again. I'm very delighted to welcome you to this evening's program, Becoming Queer, Warhol in the 1950s, and Jarrett Robert Austin's Camille from 1953. Just a little, preamble. Warhol arrived in New York from Pittsburgh in 1949, and if you've seen the exhibition, you'll know the second gallery is really devoted to the period of the 1950s. When Warhol came to New York in 1949 from Pittsburgh, he started a more than decade-long career as a commercial illustrator in the fashion and advertising world. He simultaneously also pursued a career as a fine artist, with the first exhibition of drawings based on the writings of Truman Capote, who he had hoped to meet. Fortunately, didn't do that till much later. During this time, he also made hundreds of drawings, homoerotic drawings of men's feet, portraits of men in drag, and none of these were exhibited publicly. They're really for Warhol's very private use. A key figure in Warhol's early career was his friendship with the photographer Otto Fenn. They'd been introduced through mutual industry friends in 1951, and Warhol showed Fenn his portfolio, which he immediately liked. Fenn worked for many of the leading magazines of the day, including Harper's Bazaar and the Ladies' Home Journal, and he did portraits of celebrities, including, some of you may not even know who these people are, some of you will, Tallulah Bankhead, Jackie Gleason, Sid Caesar, Betty Davis, and Yves Montand, as well as advertising for Lord & Taylor department store. So Warhol became a frequent visitor at Fenn's 58th Street photo studio. They collaborated on projects together, and Fenn took many photographs, wonderful photographs of the young Warhol. The studio was also a great gathering place for many gay men. They had parties, they often dressed in drag, and Warhol produced drawings of many of these individuals, some of which are on view in the exhibition. I was very privileged to have met Otto Fenn in 1988 when I went out to Sag Harbor, where he was living with his partner, John Krug, and very delighted Deborah Hallam, John's niece, is with us this evening. And together they ran the 1964 Sag Harbor Antique Shop. An amateur filmmaker, Austin, shot Camille on Fire Island and in New York at Fenn's studio. If I'm saying something that sounds like it was in the website, forgive me. It just sounded so good, I just took it. So thank you, Megan and Izzy, because you're the ones who wrote it. It's an audacious and outrageous drag parody of the 1936 George Cukor classic film starring Robert Taylor and Greta Garbo, when apparently, all-male cast, Austin retells Alexandre Dumas' 19th century tragedy of a tubercular French courtesan. Oh, I haven't heard that word for a long time. Tubercular French courtesan kept by a rich baron and pursued by a besotted younger man. Austin listed his friends as actors, including Fenn, who's thought to appear as Baron de Varville. While Warhol does not appear in Camille, he was absolutely in on the joke, on the send-up of this film. He sent postcards about the film to Fenn that featured the two stars, Robert Taylor and Greta Garbo. So for 45 years, this film was preserved by Jack Davidson, a resident of Cherry Grove, where the film was made, and Austin's close friend. In 2015, Davidson donated the film to the Cherry Grove Archives Collection Committee. And, it's important to remember that this film was made during the heyday of McCarthyism, when homosexuality and drag were illegal. The film is indeed a testament to the creative spirit of the queer community, but also the creative spirit of these amazing minds who really could occupy these incredible places of fantasy, but places that they couldn't also occupy in public. So, one of the reasons we were so excited when we heard about this film, for me, of course, as a historian, I had read about it, but then when you actually find out it exists, It does give you a sense, I think, of the playfulness, of the spirit, of the innovation, and also of the context of a 1950s New York, where being a gay person was an extremely difficult thing to do. I'm very delighted to say things have gotten better. Let's hope they stay that way. I think together with our presentations, we're really going to have this sense of that period in the 50s. We're extremely grateful to the Cherry Grove Archives Collection Committee for preserving, digitizing, and lending us Camille, and especially Susan Kravitz and Parker Sargent, as well as Carl Luss. So I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Megan Ewer and Izzy Dow, because they're extraordinary to work with. They've put their heart and souls into doing great programming throughout the Warhol show. So just a little setup. After our presentations, there'll be about a 2-minute break. That does not mean you run to the bathroom or anything unless you absolutely have to, because we're going to go then right into the film. So we're delighted, and I'm particularly delighted to welcome two distinguished curators and historians this evening, Nina Schleif and Trevor Fairbrother, who will discuss this aspect of Warhol's art, followed by a screening of Jarrett Robert Austin's 53 film, Camille. Nina Schleif is a German art historian, Americanist, curator, and head of the graphic art department at the Art Museum in Regensburg, Germany. And in between, I hope you get some time off there, too. In 2013, she initiated and curated the first exhibition anywhere of Andy Warhol's oeuvre in books at Museum Brandhurst in Munich. She's also the editor and co-author of Reading Andy Warhol, Haja Kant's 2014, and the author of Drag and Draw, Andy Warhol, The Unknown 50s, published by University of Chicago Press. Her forthcoming projects include an exhibition and catalog on the artist books of Kiki Smith, taking place next spring in Munich, and an essay on something I'm excited about. I just met with the curator from Vienna. It's actually another Warhol show at MUMAC in Vienna, and you'll be writing about Warhol's exhibitions of the 1950s. I'm particularly happy to welcome Trevor Fairbrother, who's someone I've known for quite a long time. Trevor wrote a really incredibly groundbreaking essay in an exhibition I did of the early work of Warhol in 1989, Success is a Job in New York. It's really the first article that took on exploring Warhol's art and sexual identity, and I think it's become a kind of standard for many who followed afterward. Trevor is an independent curator and scholar. He's written extensively on Andy Warhol, and most recently an essay for our catalog in Andy Warhol From A to B and Back Again, and is the author of Painting Summer in New England, John Singer Sargent, The Sensualist, and Ipswich Days, Arthur Wesley Dow and His Hometown, all Yale University Press. His curatorial work includes exhibitions, and very innovative ones, I might add, for the Museum of Fine Arts Boston, the Seattle Art Museum, and the Peabody Essex Museum, among others. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to these two distinguished individuals. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you lower the lights a tiny bit, or if it's not illegal? I'd sooner it feel more like a movie house than a shop window, so that'd be nice. Thank you, Andy Warhol, and thank you, Whitney Museum of American Art. The museum business studiously ignored Warhol's first slide. The museum business studiously ignored Warhol's identity as a queer artist when he was alive. In 1989, 2 years after his death, the Museum of Modern Art presented a memorial retrospective. That project upheld the protocol of silence expected by the homophobic ruling class. 50 blocks south of MoMA, there was a smaller Warhol show at the Grey Art Gallery. The director there was Tom Sokolowski, a gay man who supported queer visibility and public actions that focused attention on the AIDS crisis. The exhibition at the Grey was Donna DeSalvo's landmark survey of Warhol's career in the 1950s. The essay I contributed to Donna's catalog was the first to look at Warhol's art in light of his sexuality. I poached the title, Tomorrow's Man, from an American physique magazine published in New York. Tab Hunter exemplifies the trim and sexy masculinity that Warhol relished in the 1950s. Young Warhol was fixated on his own build and looks. He often affected a mixture of shy and foppish mannerisms. He was, however, very sophisticated and self-confident. When the 60s dawned, he was hustling for a new career as a gallery artist. His efforts were in sync with the advent of pop art. As an avant-garde painter, he took a taciturn and enigmatic stance. Many dismissed him as a faddist and a phony, and some people in the counterculture did sense that he was shrewd and unruly in interesting ways. He associated himself with free spirits and people who resisted conventional social norms. His film Kiss was a compilation of short reels of people locking lips, and he daringly included man-to-man action. Mario Montez was an actor and drag performer whom Warhol featured in several films. He liked to slip positive hints about gay life into his work. In My Hustler, a straight woman and a gay man are in bitchy competition for the attentions of this young stud. Soon, the FBI was monitoring him, Warhol, and he was the target of expose journalism in Confidential magazine. In an era when homosexuality was outlawed, Warhol did not lie or pretend to be straight. On the other hand, he did not become a militant crusader, perhaps because he lived through the witch hunts conducted against communists and homosexuals in the 1950s. So, when reporters asked, "Are you gay?" he ducked the question and used evasive lines. He might say, "Oh, sex is such hard work," or "sex is so abstract." Homophobia and gender bias were influences on Warhol's artistic voice. They inspired him to adopt oblique and elliptical strategies to find weird and indirect registers in which to speak about taboo subjects. Next, I have a swift and silent visual essay. This is my silent movie. It shows Warhol's special ability to stage manage his public face, and it charts his trajectory as a pushy and seditious media star. While doing research for Tomorrow's Man, I found these items in the artist's papers that were still housed in his last studio. First is a professional award from 1952. There's a pencil inscription on the top flap of the envelope. It says, Andrew Warhol, Her Medal. This is the camp humor that heartened the gay subculture. The second item is a copy of One, a monthly magazine with a primary interest in homosexuality. Clearly, he was informed about organized efforts to combat discrimination. Art directors supervised the illustrations that he produced in the 1950s. He was usually chosen for work that targeted female consumers. Not surprisingly, his early career as an illustrator became grist for the mill when orthodox modernists chose to deride Warhol as the poster boy of pop art. He always wanted to make and exhibit art on his own terms. These are early drawings from a solo exhibit that tried to capitalize on his reputation as a shoe illustrator. They are symbolic portraits of new celebrities, audaciously effeminate Truman Capote and suave Julie Andrews. In 1956, the Museum of Modern Art hung one of Warhol's shoe pictures in a survey of contemporary American drawings. The artist gamely offered it as a gift to the permanent collection, and the director turned it down. Life magazine published this spread of the show about the show of drawings in 1957, soon after it had closed. Warhol structured this layout as a spectrum, one end as an indomitable woman, Kate Smith. The other end unites two ardent young men, Elvis and Jimmy Dean. And in the middle, there are three fancy gals, Truman, Julie, and Zsa Zsa. And as if an excuse were needed for depicting Truman in that way, the caption mentions that he has a play right now on Broadway called House of Flowers. This is a portrait of Christine Jorgensen, who was a tabloid sensation in 1953. Prior to surgery in Denmark, she had been William, an ex-GI from the Bronx. The artist's use of two mismatched shoes was brilliant. His silver and gold extravaganza did not shirk the hard-boiled facts. Fairies abound in Warhol's illustration from the 1950s. This is his cover for a reprint of three quirkily refined stories from the World War I era. Ronald Furbank's social satires have been described as improper fairy tales intended for exceptionally knowing adults. Warhol self-published several books in which he married studious frivolity to thinly veiled eroticism. These whimsical items served him well as gifts for friends and prospective clients. The title of this one refers to There Are Fairies at the Bottom of Our Garden, which was a 1917 song that Beatrice Lillie was still performing in the 50s as a parody of Victorian principles. One of Warhol's solo exhibitions was a collection of drawings he called Studies for a Boy Book. The announcement promised a cultish look at handsome and dreamy young men. But alas, Warhol did not produce that book. Another idea that was pursued but never finished was a volume devoted to feet. The example on the left, you can see it upstairs, attests to Warhol's fluid imagination and his amazing talent for composition. The other drawing is a Cecil Beaton fantasy that the artist inscribed to the gay Philadelphia collector and curator Henry McElhenney. Warhol's desire to explore contour drawing may have been inspired by various modernists, from Beardsley and Picasso to Ben Shahn, but the one artist who had used this kind of linear silhouette to render homoerotic subjects was Jean Cocteau. I'm comparing a Warhol with three works that Cocteau published in 1929. Warhol's explorations of queer content in the 50s proved to be harbingers of his later, more broadly distributed projects. Think of Blowjob, the movie from 1963, or Flesh from 1968. Also, this album cover for the Rolling Stones from 1971. He chose a close-up photo of jeans and a bulging crotch. Then he incorporated a real zipper to garnish the illusory bait. The artist made this project, this flyer, to advertise himself in the 1950s. It is exquisitely printed on translucent pale green paper. The female message bearer wears a revealing costume and holds a giant rose. Tattoos cover her skin, and Warhol's name and phone number are blazoned across her belly. Her tattoos represent over 30 business logos and product names, including General Electric and Pepsodent toothpaste. These juxtapositions may bring perspective to Warhol's tattooed lady. The woman on the left is indeed a staggering spectacle, but she manifests a serene demeanor for the photographer. The etching on the right conjures a brazen performance by a woman with large breasts. Otto Dix uses a harsh style and stresses the tough reality of trafficking in sexual desire. In comparison, Warhol's concoction has a naive, doll-like charm. It could be a rendering of a vernacular or folk art sculpture. But she was definitely a showgirl and a good alter ego for Warhol and his male friends. She also embodies the vibrant tenor of his magazine work in the 50s. Consider this conglomeration of beauty products he depicted for Harper's Bazaar. In 1982, Art Forum commissioned a special insert from Warhol. Consciously or not, the result echoes his early tattooed woman. The title page, Forged Image, faces a picture of Warhol in drag. This beginning suggests the bright, no-nonsense chic of high modernist graphic design. Then there's a gatefold, which opens to this boisterous spread. These are new paintings from his dollar sign series. At first, they may seem merely reckless and histrionic, but thoughtful looking might elicit an underlying sense of uncertainty. They invoke a fever dream of the almighty dollar, the restless flashing of a demonic neon sign. Warhol made this magazine project at a time when many critics claimed he was in professional decline. I think he's repudiating, in his inverted way, the notion that his art had grown slack and vapid. The words forged image tell us that we must deal with a fake and a sham. His theme is artificiality. The drag photograph is an illustration of that. A man masquerading as a woman who wears masculine-coded garments. Gender conventions are unmoored. I ended my essay for the Gray Art Gallery with the following sentence about the Art Forum project. Warhol mirrored back at the art world dumb and beautiful stereotypes of commercialism and homosexuality, the things about him that most bothered most people. My Warholian inclination was probably guiding me in 1995 when I convinced the Museum of Fine Arts Boston to purchase this selection of near life-size photographs by Kathy Opie. She was in her early 30s, and she identified as a queer artist from the get-go. In this series, titled Portraits, she paid homage to her lesbian and gay friends in Los Angeles. Now that these pictures are taking a place on a historical timeline, they make it easier to perceive the audacity of Warhol's groundbreaking achievements. Thank you.
Okay. I'm very happy to be here tonight. and I would like to thank the Whitney Museum for having me, for inviting me. This is a great honor to be here. And I would like to thank Donna on behalf of all Warholians for this wonderful exhibition. It's an amazing experience. It's a great pleasure. It's so much fun to walk through it. It's an eye-opener, and we're really very lucky to be able to see such an exhibition in our lifetime. I don't think it's really, no, it's really not something we should be taking for granted. It's very difficult to have exquisite Warhol exhibitions like that, or I don't think it's almost possible at all anymore to have them. But I'll stop here and start with my talk. When I mentioned to some friends that I was going to be in a program called Becoming Queer, I realized the irony this title chosen by the museum lent my presentation. Before I started to work on Andy Warhol's art, I admittedly knew next to nothing about queer life. My fascination with his 1950s work jump-started me to learning about it. The three most enlightening studies of this aspect of Warhol's life were, to me, Trevor's 1989 text, Tomorrow's Man, the unpublished dissertation by Neil Prince, editor of the catalog Raisonné of Warhol, and Richard Mayer's Warhol chapter in his monograph Outlaw Representation. But then I also think that Warhol would have enjoyed the irony of me talking about becoming queer. To him, queerness was closely linked to role play, and he was endlessly fascinated by the many shapes it can take, and he had relatively few preconceived notions about it. Since one focus of my research was Warhol's 1950s drawings that featured drag, my focus tonight will be on sharing with you some examples and situating them in the context of his social life. In the second part of my talk, I propose that Warhol knew not only John Cooker's Camille, which he most certainly did because it was, as was Garbo herself, a gay icon, but that he also knew Austen's Camille spoof. Even though there's nothing in the film to suggest that Warhol contributed to its making, I think Donna already mentioned that there is some indication and that there are some items that I will be showing that very much suggest that he shared and enjoyed the sentiment of the film, at least. But we'll discuss this later on. The drag motif held an enormous fascination for Warhol and reappeared in his work from his school days in Pittsburgh on to his late drawings, paintings, and photographs. The present retrospective lets us track this fascination by including, for example, 1950s drawings of men in drag, 1960s films featuring drag queens, examples from his 1974 series titled Ladies and Gentlemen, featuring Afro-American and Latino cross-dressers and drag queens, as well, as well as prints from two 1981 photo sessions in which Warhol himself posed in drag. Possibly with the exception of the 1950s drawings, the other works may seem familiar and have had a certain visibility. My own interest was in the context and the concrete stimulus that triggered Warhol to conceive these works at this specific time. I would like to share with you some of my thoughts. Key to both the drawing series of Men in Drag and the film you are about to see is, apart from the fact that drag is an essential feature in both, the year 1953. There is a number of reasons for dating the drawings to 1953, and the Camille spoof was finished and premiered that same year. As it turns out, they have more in common still. Both Austin's Camille and Warhol's drawings owe their existence to the circle of friends around photographer Otto Fenn. You will see Fenn in one of the few male roles in the film. For a while, Andy Warhol was part of that circle. He was introduced to Fenn in 1951, and they remained friends until Warhol's death. When they met, the photographer had a studio in the Gray Bar building on Lexington Avenue that also housed the offices of fashion magazine publisher Condé Nast and the studio of Irving Penn. Fenn was making a living in editorial and fashion photography. He had learned the ropes while working for the Harper's Bazaar photographer Louise Dahl Wolfe in 1952. He moved his studio to 58th Street between Lexington and Park. Parts of tonight's film were shot at that studio, and in later years, Fenn screened the film there to a private and appreciative audience. A handful of Fenn's photographs are in the Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh today, and a larger body of Fenn's work survives as Otto Fenn personal papers. This material helps in reconstructing the nature of Fenn's and Warhol's friendship and collaborations. Helpful was also that I was able to talk to a member of their circle, and he shared his recollections with me. I suspect that other artists created similar works related to the gay life, as it was called. In a very few instances, photographs or recollections were published. But it appears that until recently, much was considered not publishable or was lost entirely. Let me say that I do hope this will be changing. In 1953, Fenn and Warhol were very close. Their interests crossed in several ways, as the following examples will show. As you see in this image, Warhol would sometimes provide hand-drawn props for Fenn's fashion shoots. In the exhibition, you will find this spoof of such a session. The same props were used. The man in dress-up is Fenn's friend, the makeup artist Billy Lowe, performing for Fenn's camera. Both Fenn and Warhol were frequent guests at a salon hosted by Fenn's friend Bill Cecil, a set designer. By becoming part of their circle, Warhol had privileged access to the parties they gave, to their weekend trips to Cherry Grove, which was the other shooting location for Camille, and to some of their friends who enjoyed dressing up in drag. As Warhol's drawings from that time reveal, he also had access to private photos that Fenn took of men in drag. Let me show you a few examples. As we all know, Warhol loved parties, and some of the earliest he went to were hosted by Otto Fenn. One example is the annual Sapphire Ball, a New Year's Eve party. Drag was an important and fun element of these festivities. Surviving photos show the liberal atmosphere. In attendance were men and women, mixed and unisex couples, people in and out of costume, some men in drag. Warhol did only this one drawing after Fenn's party photos. It shows a dancing male couple. Warhol also made drawings of men in low drag. Very often, he would do 4 or 5 takes of one person, and that, in addition to the varied poses, leads me to suspect that he did these after-life models. I think the sitters knew he was drawing them and posed for him. The perfect, because permissible, context for these sittings would have been as a side venue to one of Fenn's parties. Fenn produced a series of photos that, in my view, was especially created with Warhol in mind, or perhaps even upon his instructions. A number of the contact sheets on view in the exhibition can be linked to specific Warhol drawings. For these sessions, Warhol worked with 2 models, himself and Billy Lowe, whom you saw horsing around earlier in the black outfit. Judging by the surviving contact sheets and negatives, Fenn staged 3 photo sessions of himself in drag. There are Warhol drawings after specific images from each of the 3 sessions. Here's one example. Judging by the number of images that survive, it was the most extensive sitting. Fenn appears with a little moustache and is wrapped in a daybed serving as a stole. Warhol came up with a series of drawings. Remarkably, they are all based on the most subdued of these contact sheets. For one motif, he had a special purpose in mind, a book project where he used Fenn's act to illustrate the letter M. I have proposed to call this manuscript Ladies' Alphabet. Warhol created it in 1953 in collaboration with poet Thomas H. Ward. Each page sported one woman whose pose embodied the respective letter in the alphabet that started the accompanying rhyme. This is something you can see in some letters, especially. See it really nicely, or K here. He chose the image especially to personify this letter. The book never made it to print, and since it was conceived as an alphabet book, we know that some pages are missing. Warhol never finished the project, but he self-published a less daring alphabet book in that same year, 1953. As we saw earlier, Fenn's friend Billy Lowe also had a knack for posing in drag. Warhol developed a series of drawings that show him with his balding head and in a man's suit. His play with pearls is quite wild. In another part of that same session, Lowe wears a wig. From these images, Warhol derived a number of drawings. 2 of them were included in Ladies' Alphabet as ladies or letters A and G. Initially, I thought that only Lady M was a man because of the obvious moustache and because Fenn's contact sheets survive in the Warhol Museum. But as I identified other photographs Warhol had used, it became clear that he deliberately mixed real life and drag ladies. Among the drawings of females that I took into consideration as having been intended for but never making it into Ladies' Alphabet was this one. It is the same drawing style as the other ladies and can be dated to 1953. I was able to identify her as Greta Garbo. Warhol used a promotional photo from her 1934 film, The Painted Veil. My final point is that, after all, Warhol might be directly linked to both the original and the spoof versions of Camille, namely by a set of film postcards of Cukier's Camille that Warhol reworked, and Donna mentioned these postcards earlier. The postcard itself was issued by the Museum of Modern Art and shows Garbo as Camille in a loving embrace with Robert Taylor playing Armand. Warhol intended for, but never sent off, this particular copy to author Truman Capote, whom he admired from afar at the time. The card is in the Warhol Museum. As you can see, Warhol identifies with Garbo by captioning the scene on the reverse as "me and my cat" and pasting a meow speech bubble next to Armand. He did send off 7 of these postcard collages to his friend Otto Fenn. They recently reappeared on the art market. For most of them, he used excerpts from a French language textbook that are humorous for failing to relate to the love scene. To me, these read like a tribute to the funny intertitle cards in Austen's Camille. These playfully mix French and English, a device that can be qualified as high camp. As a recipient of these collaged postcards, Otto Fenn would have understood and appreciated Warhol's allusion to Austen's Camille. Thank you for your attention. And we'll be happy to take questions now or enter a discussion, and we'll screen the film afterwards. Maybe, yeah, 15 minutes of a discussion, and we were also hopeful, I might add, that maybe someone's in the audience who was actually there for the filming of the film. So if you are there or here, please identify yourself, because there are a number of people who would be very happy and interested to meet you. Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Do you have any?
So, are there questions in the audience, or should we?
It's hard to, yes.
The postcards are so amazing that you just showed. I don't think anyone knew that those existed before. And oh, sorry. Thank you. So the postcards that you just showed on the screen are really incredible, and I don't think we knew that those existed before. The one to Truman Capote that was never sent, Neil Prince writes about. But I wonder, does you think about that original postcard as between Warhol and Capote and this relationship that he imagined having with him. But it seems like there's more to the film and to postcards in general that we didn't know about, that these might hint to with Warhol's use of postcards and correspondence. I just wonder if you could talk about how what you think about that discovery and how it sheds light on his use of postcards in friendship with other people.
But I think it's interesting to me that the postcards come from the Museum of Modern Art, and you think of so many artists got their start there, or went, learned about the history of film there. So in a sense, Warhol is using something that was very easy to access, this postcard from a famous film, but then he completely subverts it. And so I see that his doing something like that is. There are gay artists like Jess in San Francisco at the same time is also doing interventions or taking comics and changing the words in the speech bubble. So it's a kind of third or fourth generation surrealism. It's my take, but camp surrealism, queer surrealism.
Donna was the one who probably knew about these postcards the longest. But what I also find interesting is there's still a stack of unused postcards in the Warhol Museum that he probably intended to maybe send to other friends or to other admired personalities. And I guess in the end he didn't dare send them. I mean, he never writes his name on any of these because, the postman might read them. I mean, there was a real danger in really sending them with too obvious messages. And I see them in that light as well. Yeah.
But he also pushed the envelope with the double entendres. I mean, like the book, The Fairies in the Bottom of Our Garden, that's really, there's some very naughty sexual jokes in there.
Yes.
I think the next to last page is, correct me if I get it wrong, but it's a little girl holding a kitten in her lap, and it says, "Have you seen my little pussy?" And then you turn the page and it's a couple of cherubs, and then over the buttocks it says, the end. So, but again, you're right, he's not sending that through the mail. That's a book that he could give to his pals. Yeah.
I also think that the manuscript I showed, that he stopped working on that because he was really afraid for his friends and for being, being uncovered as using drag images. And so the actual alphabet book that he did finish, as Trevor was the first to point out, there are some innuendo scenes where he couples two men and has a little rhyme with the snake and the mother and these things. But there was always a second level where you could read these images and how you could read these images. So that wasn't as dangerous as I think was the other manuscript.
I think that one of the issues that like when I wrote that essay, I mean, it was the AIDS crisis was just hell, and the idea of the Museum of Modern Art doing that show and not even saying Andy was gay. So I was kind of, I wanted to be upfront about that, but then I now think, looking back, did I overstate it? So I began by saying Warhol was completely open and honest as a gay man, and the finely focused art historians could go back in and say, well, actually, he evaded here and he evaded there, and so. But I think the whole the evasion thing is, it's sort of like, is the glass half full? Is it half empty? Was he aggressively queer compared to most artists in his generation, or was he self-protective? I mean, obviously he survived, but I think he was both. And I tried to kind of give a sense of that in the pictures I showed.
What I also thought was or is interesting, and I haven't quite come to terms with it, is there's an anecdote, an episode that he had with Henry Geltzeller. I think it was 1961. This curator from the Metropolitan Museum, whom he admired very much, sort of pushed and helped his career along, and the breakthrough came in 1962. But before this breakthrough came, there was an afternoon where Warhol showed Geltzeller his 1950s drawings, and we don't know what selection it was, but Geltzeller spoke very negatively about these drawings and probably suggested also that they were too gay and he shouldn't be showing them around, and they wouldn't help his career along. And that was in my book, that was one of the reasons why Warhol did not really show the 1950s drawings around so much after he had his breakthrough as a pop artist in '62.
But I think there's a kind of funny push-pull as well, because like his first retrospective that came to New York was organized, I guess, in California. It went all around Europe and then came back to the Whitney. And so it was 70 or something, 71 by the time it came back to the Whitney. And at that point, there's the book dealer, I'm blanking. Andreas Brown, Gotham Bookstore. So he sees that show, and he's of that generation, and he thinks, wait a minute, how could they erase, the 50s work? So he organizes a show of Andy Warhol in the 50s just to prove that there was another Andy Warhol. And Warhol, I think, was a little leery about was that good or bad, although in the catalog from that first retrospective, those reviews of the 50s work are in the bibliography. So I mean, maybe Warhol didn't know that Leo Castelli had put them in the bibliography, but so the 50s work was there and not there. And didn't you, Donna, didn't you have the same problem? Like you wanted to do this show and Andy was alive, but then...
Thank you. Well, when I interviewed Warhol in the fall of '86, so it's not that long before he died. I was interested in the hand-painted works from 1960 to 62, but I asked him a lot about his commercial artwork of the 50s. And I started saying, well, there are all these wonderful things and drawings, and he just said, he just kind of just pushed them aside. And he was certainly not interested in for me to do the show of the work of the 50s. After he died, it was Fred Hughes, his right-hand man at the factory, who really said, no, I want you to do it. And he was incredibly supportive. But I would just add that, I mean, two things. One is, you know, there's that great exchange with Emile D'Antonio that's in Popism when, you know, he asked, why don't Jasper Johns and Bob Rauschenberg like me? And D'Antonio says, because you're too swish. And so, you know, I mean, I think what you're saying is absolutely on point, that you could only go so far. And Warhol was sort of more out there than, he was certainly more out there than many of the commercial artists I had interviewed at the time and some of the art directors I'd interviewed at the time. But I would like to ask a question, which is, I've often started to more and more have thought that in some ways, that this milieu and this gathering place, a kind of salon that Otto Fenn essentially put together, is in some way a kind of prototype for the later factory. And I just wondered if you felt the same way. And you know, I came to it late in my thinking about it, but I thought, well, did he learn something there? Because it was the factory, we had a similar kind of thing where people could be somewhat what they could not be in everyday life, could be a superstar. So I just wondered if you would, what your thoughts are on that observation.
Well, in a way, I mean, I guess you could say, I mean, I think Andy Warhol did have this thing, he was very good at spotting talent and then kind of embracing it, and if you will, maybe using it as in a Warhol product and then moving on to the next talent that he spotted. So, you know, he did that with so many people, Edie Sedgwick, Gerard, all those kinds of people. But, you know, maybe the first one was Otto, like maybe he stole Otto's on the salon idea. I mean, that makes sense.
I spoke to one of the people who were around at the time when they did the film, and he remembered that Warhol at the time wasn't particularly charming, and he certainly wasn't good looking in the sense that they considered people to be good looking, you know, the group of men. And he said, but we still liked having him because he had such a talent, and we really wanted him there for the talent. And so I think one important thing he learned in that group of friends was that his art would open doors for him, and that it would give him access to groups or to people that otherwise he wouldn't have had access to. So that was probably one of the important lessons he learned there. And then, yeah.
I think one thing about this film that we're about to see is, I mean, it's so funny and wonderful, but if you look at an Andy Warhol film from the 60s, you know, they are so like tatty and fuzzy and out of focus. I mean, not all of them, but I mean, they are so low budget. And I think that's interesting to think about when you see this, because this is home movies of the, I guess, like luxury home movies. I mean, the production values, you know, they have the titles. I mean, you need money to do this. And so you then start wondering, and who are these guys? And presumably they're, I mean, it's before my time, but I imagine there are a lot of prep school types and Ivy League types, and maybe, this is all my imagining, but that's what I imagine, and I imagine that they have, you know, their fancy white-collar day jobs, and then they get to go to Fire Island and hang out and have fun, and do all of this other stuff. But I think that's, to look at them as like, who are they in real life is an interesting way to look at this movie. But I think that also explains the there's French spoofs. You know, there was a whole, I think, a thing in the 50s, like it's called fractured French or something. People, it was like in the New Yorker, there was a lot of jokes using French language, but you know, you had to have studied French at college to be able to do that. So it's a kind of a couth cocktail circuit kind of humor. But this movie is so darn good at that. And the other, my favorite thing right now in Donna's show, I mean, there's so many, but the movie called Taylor and Me, or yeah, Taylor Mead. That, if you haven't seen that, find it, you know, time it so that you can see that on the loop, because I think that is really interesting in relation to this movie. And it's unusual to see Andy in a movie, and he plays this role as a kind of, I haven't seen it enough to figure it out, but Taylor Mead seems to be first playing the part of like a god, or, you know, he's some sort of like mythical being, and Andy comes on with like the cupbearer to the gods. So Andy comes on with this tray, and he's being sort of meek, and he offers this stuff to Taylor, and then at some point it says, I guess it's a cigarette. So then Taylor has cigarettes, and then he pops a pill, and then he becomes demonic, and then he's riding on a horse, and then he's got a hat, and he looks like Maurice Chevalier, and then he's suddenly doing like a hoochie coochie dance, and again, so it's sort of like a silent movie, but it is very interesting with this kind of, so it's not drag, but it's very subversive and crazy, and he's doing it in front of a race riot painting, which is also strange, because it's sort of like a backdrop in a you know, a tent show or something from the 1920s, and at some point Taylor turns to the painting, and I think he sort of like makes to touch the genitals of one of the dogs in the, you know, in the police dog, and then he's got his back to the painting, and then he pulls up his T-shirt, you see his naked back, and then he turns around, and suddenly he's like a Madonna, you know, with praying hands. So it's really interesting, that, and thank you for putting it in the show.
No, it's my colleague Claire Henry who curated the film series, and is the whole series we have throughout the show, so I thank her. Oh, sorry.
I think that's like the perfect segue, if I may. So hang tight. We're going to do the quickest changeover you've ever seen, and then Camille. Thank you both so much.